All right, today is class 7. We're going to start with a question we asked last time. Can anyone explain to me what realism is? Starting with going back to kind of forms, going back to how realism is different than materialism. This is a big, like kind of a hard thing to do, but it's kind of the main theme of this class. Can anyone explain that? Yes. And specifically how forms relate to this idea of forms, which is kind of the core of Platonic and Aristotelian thoughts, and St. Thomas too. It's all revolves around the forms. Okay, that's okay. I'll just repeat this. So, remember we talked about a form is an idea, right? So everything has a form. We have idea of a car. We can have the idea of a truck, the idea of the sky, the idea of water, the idea of gold. Let's talk about more specifically the idea of a triangle, right? So you have isosceles, scaling, equilateral, but the idea of a triangle has the perfections of all these triangles, right? Isosceles, scaling, equilateral, but it's specifically none of them. Whenever you have a physical triangle, an actual triangle, it's always one of those three. But as humans, we understand this immaterial concept of triangle. And that's what we call a form, this immaterial concept. The concept has all three of those in one concept. We can understand the concept of animal, right? Dogs, cats, humans, birds, they all are animals. But when you have an individual animal, you have a dog, a cat, this bird, right? But you can never just see animal walking down the street, right? Animal is an immaterial concept that doesn't actually exist in the real world. Okay? These concepts are what we call forms. How do we come to know things? We see things that are consist of matter and form. So we see like a dog. A dog has the form of dog, and that form is in the matter, right? And when we comprehend dog, our intellect grasps the form of dog. When we see gold, we have gold, the form of gold, in matter, and we grasp that form of goldness. Okay, we learn through grasping forms. That is what realism is. Materialism said that all that's out there is really just particles, just matter. If there's just matter out there, then where do things like color, smell, taste, where do these things come from? All that's out there is matter. That's what the materialists say. And that means that these color, taste, touch, what you feel, what you sense, that's just created in your mind. It's your way of understanding the world outside of you. Where realism, the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle and Plato, says no. The colors actually exist in the thing. And the form of yellowness exists in this book. The form of whiteness exists in this table. And we are comprehending these forms through our intellect. Our intellect actually understands the things that are outside of us. And we'll go in more into that later, but we'll just stay there for right now. So here's a question. Did modern science disprove Aristotle? Because if we look at modern science, a lot of the modern scientists are really materialists. People like Newton, Albert Einstein. You see materialism. How do they explain the universe? Well, the universe is really just particles. What's that atom? Atom is just smaller particles made of smaller particles. Everything is ultimately just particles. What are or strings? Yes, or strings. And then what are you and I? We're just strings or particles in a random combination, and you add those combinations up, and then that's kind of what a human is. There's nothing more to it than that. Chemical processes, yes. And chemical processes are ultimately just particles bouncing around. Sure. What do you mean? So yeah, there's you have something that's tangible, different ideologies are talking about the same thing, but they're just macro. Yeah, okay, we're going to get into that, and you are correct. Um, the problem with the materialism, it's not that it studies the material, but that it says all that exists is the material, and that's where the problem is. I'm going to get into that. So if we look at a lot of modern science through materialism, we have been able to predict a lot of things, right? Okay, so does this show that Aristotle is completely wrong in what he believed? You know, for example, we sent people to the moon and back. We predict rockets. We do all sorts of very useful engineering, right? It's all a lot of materialist philosophy behind that. Um, I should say a lot of the people who did this were filled with materialist philosophy, okay? And they still had success. And the reason they had success is because there is a truth to the material elements, but the problem is they're lacking a greater and more broad understanding of the thing. So there's actually, um, let's go over some of the things Aristotle talked about. So Aristotle does this modern science disprove Aristotle? And the answer is both yes and no. So in what ways does modern science disprove Aristotle? It has shown that some of Aristotle's thoughts were false. For example, Aristotle believed that that heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects, which has been proven scientifically to be false. So there were little things that Aristotle got wrong. He believed there were four elements, and that planets are made out of the fifth element, and that certain planets went in perfect rotations around the sun and whatnot, or around the Earth and whatnot. But these things about the perfect rotation and stuff, they were wrong. But just because Aristotle had a few things wrong, the more fundamental beliefs about philosophy of nature are still true. Now, I'm sure Albert Einstein got some things wrong, but the fact that Albert Einstein got something wrong doesn't mean that everything he said is false. And the same is true for Aristotle. So there is a group down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It's called the Institute for Advanced Physics. And their whole movement is at universities to teach classical physics. You have at most universities alongside the Aristotelian physics. In the beginning, they draw on the board of their class and they say, this is what you learn in the average physics class. Then they draw a larger circle around it and say, this is the entire study of physics. So at the average university, what you're receiving in the physics class is basically just physics from what is useful, things you can learn to manipulate the world, okay? For the sake of engineering or whatever project you're working on. It is useful, but they're not looking at information that is important. So usually information is either useful or is important. If I mean useful in attaining some sort of end, building a house. When I say important, I mean important as far as understanding your relationship in the world. So the useful things we have gone over, but the important things that are discussed in Aristotle's physics are questions like, what is motion? We know deal with motion, but how do we explain motion philosophically? What is motion at all? Questions like, what is time? In Aristotle's class, he fully explains what is time, which is a profound question. We don't have time to go over in this class, but it's really important. So people still ask this question, but Aristotle answered this question over 2,000 years ago, and it's not lacking anything. Another question, what is the ultimate cause of motion? Why is there motion out there? Ultimately come to God, as we have shown in this class. But another thing, why is there motion at all? What causes motion? And then we'd say, well, it's just laws of nature. But really, that's not a very good answer. It's basically saying, oh, well, they just exist. Yeah, but why do things move? This might sound super basic, but it's actually quite a complicated question. And really getting down to why there's motion, what exactly is motion, what's the purpose of motion, says a lot of things about our relationship with God, our relationship with the universe. So, so this idea that modern science has disproven Aristotle's physics entirely is completely false, partly because what Aristotle is doing for the most part is asking different questions about physics than what most universities are considering when they're discussing physics.
You have a fetus and the baby is developing. All of a sudden, certain cells decided to an eye or something. Is that considered motion too?
Yeah, that'd be motion. So this might be too advanced, but the definition of motion is the actualization of a potency. I don't know if you were hearing over potency, but something's got the potential to be something else, a potential to change. So motion is one thing changes into another, a potency is actualized. To add to that, we talked about before how God is motionless. God does not move. We talked about how God is pure act. Because God is a perfect being, he is pure act. God cannot move, which is another way of saying God cannot change. That's kind of advanced maybe for this class, but maybe in the future we could go over that in more detail. Okay.
How does that translate?
Yeah, so it's a broader sense of motion. So you're thinking of a local motion. We can also speak about motion as just any time a potency is actualized. In that case, we can say angels have a type of motion insofar as they can attain new information, right? God cannot attain new information because he knows everything. So God is just perfect, has just one act, and he's done. Exactly, yeah. And that gets confusing when you see about God and the incarnation, but that's a whole nother thing. All right. So we just want to refute this idea that the purpose of that was to refute this idea that modern science has disproved Aristotelian physics and Aristotelian philosophy, and even metaphysics. Remember, what was metaphysics? Metaphysics is a study of being insofar as it's being. Well, no one's really talking about this in the scientific sphere. This idea that, well, all scientists have this idea that, well, all truth can be determined by empirical science, right? That statement itself is a statement that cannot be verified by empirical science. So itself is self-contradictory, right? You can't use empirical science to prove that all knowledge can be proven through empirical science. All right, so, but again, so people are impressed by the useful, and that is a reason for materialism to take such a stronghold. They've seen all the advances in usefulness. You know, we've been able to split an atom and create nuclear reactors. It's seen as evidence that, oh, materialism is true. But what all the materials have done is taken one aspect of physics and focused on that and just rejected the other aspects of physical things. There's actually a Dominican by the name of Father Benedict Ashley, and Father William Wallace, and he was part of what was called the River Forest Thomism movement. And he was an engineer before he was a priest. A lot of his writing he was a Dominican. A lot of his writing was taking Aristotelian philosophy and uniting it with modern science. he has a book on physics, and in there he's taking diagrams and he's taking stuff from modern science, the eye, all sorts of modern science, and he's showing how it coincides right with our understanding of Aristotelian physics. Now, did Aristotle get some things wrong? Yes, but his fundamental ideas of how things work are not contradicted by any of the modern findings of modern science. There's even a modern philosopher, and he was primarily a scientist. He helped with the re-entry formula for the space shuttle. His name was Dr. Wolfgang Smith. But he actually dedicated some time to writing books about how, when we really look at quantum mechanics, our understanding of materialism just falls apart. Things act in ways that they shouldn't. For example, you'll have things like, at one point, these particles that we think are particles exist as a particle. Another point, it will exist as a wave. Sometimes electrons will be a wave, sometimes it'll be a particle. A wave and a particle are two completely different types of things. So, but if you really examine some of his stuff, some of these problems that these bizarre things they're finding with quantum mechanics. It was Albert Einstein who famously said, God does not play dice. Kind of a frustration where you can't predict things in quantum mechanics. Things aren't happening mechanistically like they're supposed to. But some of this can actually be, some of these anomalies can be resolved by understanding the holomorphic understanding of matter. If you take the realism of St. Thomas and apply it to quantum mechanics, certain things begin to make sense. That's a very complicated topic. We don't have time to go into that in this class. But just know in the back of your mind that these empiricists who claim to have all the answers have run into major problems with explaining the world when they really start to break this down. So they themselves is evidence that they don't have all the answers they claim to. Okay. So let's go over. So we talked about realism versus idealism, or realism versus materialism. So we're going to use another word for materialism. We'll call it reductionism. Why reductionism? Because materialists reduce everything to just matter. All there ultimately is matter. Nothing else actually exists. Remember in the last class we talked about some of the famous philosophers. We had Descartes and Kant. And what did Descartes do? Descartes says he only wants to know things he is 100% sure exists. And in the end, he was really only certain of one thing he was absolutely certain existed, and that is himself. Because if we look around the world and we see things, in theory, there could be some, crazy scientist that has caused you to be delusional, and you see things that aren't actually there. But the one thing you could always be certain of, if you have the ability to question yourself, then you must know that you are a thinking thing and that you exist. At the end of Descartes' writings, really the only thing he's absolutely certain of is that he exists. And with that, we have this foundation in Cartesian philosophy that man, what is man? Man is a thinking thing. How is this different from St. Thomas Aquinas? Man's substance is the body-soul composite. That is the man. That is the essence of man. That is the whole man, body and soul. Even when heaven, we go to heaven without our body. At the general resurrection, we will get our bodies back because man is imperfect without the body. Man needs a body to be fully human. He is incomplete. The substance of man is not the soul. The substance of man is the body and the soul. That's what Aristotle taught. Do you remember how Plato taught what man is? Plato taught man is primarily a soul. The soul is trapped inside the body and trying to escape, right? When we get to heaven, we are released from the body, and now we're more perfect. Right now, it's trapped in the body because the body is imperfect and terrible, according to Plato. In Rene Descartes, we see him going back to the same thing. If all I really know is that my soul exists, my mind, I'm a thinking thing, then what is the body? And Rene Descartes has this idea that the mind, the soul, is one substance, and the body is, I don't know if he'd say it's a substance, but maybe two different substances that are kind of united. Can anyone have understanding how this would affect natural law? Any idea how that affects natural law? So the natural law worked by taking your existence, how you exist, the way God made you, and looking at the purposes you were created. But if the soul is a substance and not the body-soul composite is a substance, how does that affect natural law? Any idea? Yeah. Well, what is now the relationship in Descartes' role? What is the relationship of the soul, of the body with the soul? What is the body? So when the soul is a substance, the body is just this shell that the soul is kind of infused inside of. Yeah, it's a life force. But in Rene Descartes' system, the body is just kind of the body is its own thing, and the soul is just kind of put inside the body and runs that body, more like a man in the machine. If the body is not intimately connected to the human, an intimate part of him, like it is in Aristotle, then the natural law really falls apart. Let's just say you have, these movies where you have the person and they have the special armored suit around them, they control the armored body, right? If you go and you mutilate that armored suit, are you doing anything against your nature? No, you're just destroying the armored suit. If you do things that armored suit was made to do, are you going against any nature? No, you're not. Because the armored suit is just something around you. It's secondary to you. You are this thing inside the armored suit, but that suit is not a part of you. The way Descartes understands the soul and the body is that the body is not intimately connected with the soul. They're not one thing. You have the soul that just kind of controls the body. In theory, you could put the soul in many other types of bodies, and that soul could control those other types of bodies.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of confused. On one hand, you're saying there's Descartes.
Yeah. Well, here's another way of saying it. So, under St. Thomas, where is the soul most connected to your body? What do you think? Yep, in St. Thomas, the soul is everywhere. Every part of you that's a living is animating, given life by the soul. In Rene Descartes, we have this different question. Well, the soul is just kind of this thing that works in control like a remote of the body. So his big question is, well, where do the mind and body connect? And his thing, well, the pineal gland, that's where the mind connects to the body. Through some gland, through some organ, then the soul is able to operate and control the body. This is very different than the whole body is animated and given life by the soul. Do you see the difference now? Yeah. So again, it's more like the body is just a shell that you're controlling, rather than the body is this intimate part of your being. Do you see? So when the body is something around you that you're controlling, the whole idea of nature is different. So in our understanding, nature, what is your nature? Your nature is inclinations that come from your soul that move you to do things, right? Based on the way your body is made, is ultimately shaped partly by your soul. So your whole body is shaped a certain way for certain functions, reproduction, nourishing your body, growth, breathing, all those things, right? But in Descartes' system, in theory, the soul is just put into some sort of body. And when it's put into some sort of body, it's connected to a body. And when it's connected to some sort of body, it should start to function and live as that type of body, right? But in theory, in Descartes' system, you could have the human soul put into a body of any type of being, and that body could control that body, right?
Some of the AI materialistic people are thinking you can download somebody's brain, some kind of
Yeah.
machine, and then gone, but the brain is still functioning and working. I mean, it's really creepy.
Yeah. And see, in that system, those people don't believe in the soul. They believe that really the soul is just like a program that you put inside of some body, and now it's running it.
It's all chemical process.
Yeah. But we want to get away from that and think of the soul as something immaterial that gives the body life, that makes the thing living. Yeah, the soul is that which makes a thing living. Now, Descartes still believes the soul makes the thing living, but he believes that the soul, like I said, it just interacts through the pineal gland rather than the soul animating the whole living thing. Well, here's one thing it does. So if you touch me, my hand or my foot, you're touching me. In the Descartes system, if you touch the leg, why are you touching my leg? Why are you touching my body? It's not so much that it's you, it's just this is the current body that your soul is controlling rather than it's touching you. Does that make sense? It is crazy, but this is the logical consequence of holding the Descartes system. The Descartes system is very powerful. I mean, I would say this idea of mind and soul is the common opinion of people nowadays. But the fact you think that it sounds crazy is a good thing, because then you're probably thinking more in the lines of the way a Catholic would think about the body-soul composite. Let's put it another way, the Eucharist. What is the Eucharist? So what ultimately makes it the Eucharist is our Lord's soul is present in the Eucharist. It's not like when you have a host, it's not like his soul is present in like one little spot. His soul is present throughout the whole Eucharist, right? Because that is truly, that's not just the body that the soul of Christ is controlling at this moment. That is the body that belongs to the substance of Jesus Christ, that is animated by his soul. Yes, exactly. Hopefully that makes a little more connection to like a Catholic understanding and why, because Descartes some of his later philosophers tried to explain the Eucharist and transubstantiation. What exactly does that mean? When you're a materialist and you believe in and you're trying to explain transubstantiation, it's really hard. You can't. Descartes tried to, or I can't remember if he did or if his followers, and they actually were condemned by Rome for some of his explanation of this, his materialist thoughts. But so there's these ideas of Descartes are really dangerous. So this is a hard concept to fully understand, but hopefully by the end of this, we at least have a fundamental understanding of how materialism, modern materialism, really distorts our understanding of man and our relationship with God. So my degree is in philosophy, and I'm trying to get my school to teach this, philosophy courses. And most people, without realizing it, they're deep down there intellectual materialists. They believe in God, but they have a materialist foundation. And it's not that you have to perfectly understand the philosophy, but it's going to be very helpful and useful to understand why the materialist understanding is so damaging to our faith. And if we have a materialist understanding, it's going to help us to at least begin to grasp the realism of St. Thomas and Aristotle, because it will make aspects of our faith more clear, and it will more easily allow us to see certain errors in modern society. So by studying philosophy myself, there's so many errors that people can propose that without even reading theology, I just know it's wrong from understanding philosophy. What is man and how man works? All right, so that was a complicated part of the book. Do we have any questions about that? Go ahead.
It's not so much a question. I was listening. There's some man in Israel, his last name, he's the right-hand man to World Economic Forum.
Okay.
That's the guy.
Yeah.
And he's saying that there is no free will, there is no soul, there is no everything. He's a complete materialist, but he's the right-hand man that's intellectually influencing the World Economic Forum, which is all involved in AI. I made an agreement with the UN. UN is now trying to Agenda 30, which is this AI materialistic world where there's no God, there's no human. So to me, I see the horror of materialism up front and center. I mean, it's being pushed everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you're saying is absolutely fundamental.
Mm-hmm. And because it's so upfront, yeah, it is everywhere. It's why kids in high school need to be getting a fundamental education of why this stuff is wrong and problematic. And yeah, you're completely right. It's very much in our face now.
Creating their own theories.
Um, well, I don't know if rational is the right word. So Rene Descartes, he was involved in the occult. I believe that's where some of these thoughts came to him. A part of it is an over concern with things that aren't really that important. So why are we so concerned with having 100% certainty in our philosophy? So yes, there is a chance that what I see could be deceiving me. But even though there's a small chance, why am I rewriting all my philosophy and thoughts about things I'm absolutely certain in? Because ultimately you end up with just the only thing you're really certain is that you exist. Even in Kant's system, like Kant's morality, which you're going to get in later today, the grounds for it are really weak. I don't think it's based on anything legitimate. We went through if we accept the very obvious things like what I perceive is actually there, morality becomes pretty easy, relatively easy, the natural law to determine. Like we tell lying is a sin, certain sexual disorders are a sin, overeating is a sin based on our human nature, right? Morality is pretty easy. But if we look at Kant's system, where he tries to, based on a foundation where on things we know with certainty, things like morality is all just kind of subjective. But like Kant was extremely intelligent, and his things were reasonable and consistent. But basically, the problem with Kant is just he's trying to work on the foundation given by Descartes, where we have absolute certainty. I think we just need to abandon that. We don't need to have absolute certainty. We have plenty of certainty that what we sense is actually there. We live our whole life assuming that what we sense is actually there. So I would actually argue, if you really look at Descartes or Kant, to say, well, what we know is not really there, just kind of our imagination. What Kant is saying is that we cannot have contact with the external world. The definition of a sane person is someone who understands what his intellect conforms to what's outside of him. According to Kant, you can't do that. I would argue, according to Kant, by definition of psychology, he's insane, right? Is that correct, Paloma? So the definition of someone who is out of touch with reality is when his mind does not conform to the real world around him, right? So Kant says we actually can't have any contact with the world around us. We don't know what's actually there. So by definition, Kant believes he is insane because he doesn't know what's outside of him, right? Well, I mean, his philosophy was actually airtight, but he built on a faulty foundation. This really shows that one little fundamental foundation, one error there, can just destroy the whole system, you know? And that was, I think, more Kant's problem. He had a problem in the beginning, and he built a foundation on nothing. So let's continue what we went over last time. So yes.
One more thing, and could you put it in perspective with all of this? Because I've been thinking about this. I have a friend who worked for John Deere.
Okay.
And John Deere years ago made a harvester. And this harvester could go out in the field and clean everything up. When he got finished harvesting, there was nothing. It was the most efficient, wonderful harvester in the whole world. People who made it were so proud of it, and they thought they were really. They took it to Russia, and they showed it to these Russian farmers. And then, so they cleaned up this whole field, and they're all feeling very proud of themselves. And the farmers in Russia were looking at them, and they said, well, what happens to the poor people? And that was their reaction. So the Americans who were representing John Deere thought that was the most ridiculous, unanticipated response. But the people in the Russian farmers, they knew that the local community had the poor. And they knew that their machines left a whole bunch of stuff out in the field. And that way the poor could go and glean what was left and work. They'd have to work to get it. So they had personal dignity because they were working effectively, and they could survive because they could have food. They had a very simple, very inexpensive system to take care of farmers and take care of the poor. So there's complete culture clash with the idea that efficiency is the highest goal.
Okay. Yeah.
And I keep thinking about this, and so I'm thinking, is progress always good? Because in this situation, I think the Russians were smarter. I think they had it all worked out, and they were kinder, and there was a better quality of life than with these machines.
Sure. I think in American culture, I think part of cultural different things too. So like in American culture, we don't have that, where in Russian culture does make sense. But for American culture, it probably would be the better machine. I've never heard of poor people going out to a field and getting food from a farm. Maybe it happens here. I don't know about.
It's biblical.
Sure.
So it's for a poor country that has simple, inexpensive infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a way of taking care of their poor in this farming community. And so if they had an efficient machine, who's going to take care of the poor? Mm-hmm. And how are they going to survive? And the dignity of working for their things was not okay. So they're just going to receive charity. Idle. I mean, that wasn't good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's worth thinking about. Anyways, back to so we're gonna go back to the philosophy part about the modern philosophy. So I asked about Descartes and Kant. I'm going to go over what Kant believed real quick. So we talked about this last time. We're going to refresh it because this is really complicated stuff. So we have Descartes, who is the first modern philosopher. He sets the stage for all we know is that we exist. That's really the only thing we're really certain of. So Kant tries to develop this thought, and he concludes, well, we do sense things, somehow determines there must be stuff around us. We can't really know it. There is a material world around us, but we can't really know it, but we kind of sense and interact with it. So he calls what the phenomena, the noumena is the stuff outside of us. And we sense the noumena, outside of us, the world, through the phenomena. Okay? Yeah, exactly. But what Kant says is yes, but when we sense like color or taste or smell, we have this information that's coming to us, but it doesn't, all of this is basically particles bouncing around. But then once it gets to us, our mind creates these things like color, taste, softness. Those are things in our mind that our mind interprets the world around us, but doesn't actually exist in the external world. Okay? So before we talked about how this can be very problematic for natural law. Because once you have can't sense anything, then you can't know anything. You can't really know natures. Okay? If all I can really do is sense the world around us, that includes my body too. Yeah, I sense I have legs and arms and feet and everything, but that's just the way my mind understands it. What's really there? I don't know. No one really knows. So you can't know human nature. This idea that I understand, where realists would say, yeah, I can sense that I have a digestive system and all these things. The Kantian says, well, I mean, that's what you sense, but what's really there? You can't really understand that chaos of the noumena. You just have this perception that's your attempt to interpret it, but nothing's real. Okay, and this is what materialists deep down ultimately have to hold. Because, but here's a question we have to ask. How do these ideas like softness, blueness, greenness, redness, where do they come from? Okay, but in the Kantian system, where do they come from? He says, well, our mind just creates them. But how does our mind create this stuff? A person who is blind doesn't just create color to compensate for his lack of sight. The person who is blind has no knowledge of color unless he is one day, through an operation of some sort, given the power of sight. Well, I'm saying this proves that Kantianism is false, because the fact that we perceive color, the fact that we perceive these things, they have to come from somewhere. When you're born, you're a blank slate. You don't have colors. You don't have these things inside of you. It's not till you start sensing the world that the baby starts to understand the world around him, right? So one problem with the Kantianism is because we have these colors and stuff in our mind, where do they come from? If they weren't already inside of us, they must come from outside of us.
You see, and then someone teaches you every distinction you see has a name.
Yes.
And so as your vocabulary grows and your ability to make distinctions, you understand more and more about the world.
Correct. But in Kant's system, he claims that the colors aren't outside of us.
He says
they're not outside of us. The colors, we just make those up in our mind. Outside, there is no color. So he makes a distinction between basic quality and quantity. Outside of us are just particles in space, right? But things like color, touch, the thing that smells, Those don't have actual existence. That's just our mind interpreting the world outside of us. If you're a materialist, you can't explain color. Color isn't something material. Color is a quality of something, right? So these things like color, taste, smell, if they're not in the material world as conclave, then how do they get into our intellect? If you try to form a completely new color in your mind, you actually can't do it. Part of the reason is because to create something, this new idea, a completely new color, would require someone to create something from nothing. Now, in your mind, you could take red and think of it brighter or darker, right? You do that with orange, brighter or darker. But you can't conceive of a completely new color that's not a combination of colors we already have. And the reason is to do that would require truly creation. You're creating an idea that doesn't pre-exist, right? Everything we create, we don't create anything. We take things that already exist and we just combine them in different ways. Only God can truly create. What Kant is saying, is that when we interpret the world in colors and softness and smells, we are actually engaging in the act of creation. Man can't create, we know that. Therefore, Kantianism must be false. And that's the fact we sense these things is a big problem for the materialist. Where do these things come from? And if you're a materialist, you can't answer it. It's one of their big weaknesses. So I know there's a complicated, but do you see now after explaining that? Do you understand that problem for them? This world we perceive, where does it come from? All right, so let's talk about the category. How much time do we have? Okay, we're gonna go a little bit more. So we're going to talk about the categorical imperative. So we talked about the natural law for Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas. You look at the reproductive system, it has an end to reproduce, right? Birth control's a sin. You have the digestive system, right, to nourish the body. Well, if you eat so much food that you hurt yourself, that's a sin, okay? The intellect is perfect to know truth, right? To lie, to spread lies, is contrary to the good. You're perverting the intellect, its purpose. Lying is a sin. Through human nature, we can know, the way we're created, we can know a lot of morality. With Kant, we no longer have knowledge of the world of our nature. Maybe we have a nature, but we can't perceive the body, so you can't know external natures, right? The nature is part of that noumena. We might see natures and interpret something as a nature, but we can't actually know external natures. In a sense, yeah, you can't. I mean, you could in a subjective sense, but yeah, you really can't. But you can't know natures. So here's the Kant's question. Well, how do we have ethics? How do we know right and wrong? You can't, right? So he tries to come up with this system called the categorical imperatives. He said, well, if there are other persons out there, and I believe someone else is a person, I may not understand you're a human, but I'm a person, I'm a thinking thing, and I think, Dan is a thinking thing, then as thinking things, we should treat others in certain ways. And one of those things we should do is we should always treat other thinking things as an end and never as a means to an end. Or this is where the classical statement comes from. You should never use someone, because to use someone is somehow contrary to the good of another thinking thing. This idea that you can't use someone is not part of Catholic morality. It comes from Kantian morality. And no, maybe some books, but so this categorical imperative, John Paul II does use this in his theology of the body for some of his arguments for marriage. Because I don't accept the categorical imperative as a legitimate principle of morality, I do have problems with some of his arguments in theology of the body. Now, here's my reason why I find this. I think the only reason Kant used this principle is because he had nothing else to as a foundation for morality. He also said that you should also there was another categorical imperative, but he needed at least two. Anyways, but well, he's just trying to just from thinking because he's a philosopher, and he's trying to have ethics because with his system, he's completely gotten rid of Aristotelian ethics. So he needs some sort of ethical system. So that's where his foundation comes from. But let's for a look with Catholic theology. Can you use someone? Actually, yes, and you ought to use people. Let's just say you're doing a job, right? And you're like, oh, I'm going to go to the store. I'm going to use someone. They're going to go farm their crops. I'm going to pay them money so that I can get potatoes or vegetables, right? You're using someone, but is that a sin? No. Let's say you have a spouse, right? At times, your spouse is going to use you for various things. You're going to be doing something and you have rely on your spouse to, the wife relies on her husband to have an income and support her. She's using him in a sense, but there are some uses that are good. If someone breaks into the house and he has a gun, the wife is going to get the kids and go behind her husband and expect her husband to defend her, right? That's good and proper. She is using him to protect her, right? Is that a sin? Is that disordered? No, she should get behind her husband and expect him to protect her, right? So use in and of itself is not a sin. We have a philosophical system or a morality with looking at use as a sin. It becomes a problem because use in of itself is not a bad thing. And here's something even deeper. Use in marriage at times is absolutely necessary. So use as Kant defines it, we have to treat someone as an end, not a means to an end. Everyone should only be loving their spouse as an ultimate means of loving God. So the more pure form of loving your spouse is not to love your spouse for their own sake, but to love your spouse for God's sake. This is actually completely condemned as evil in Kantian morality. And other problems with Kantian morality is one, he also believes in his system, God cannot be known through reason alone. So in the realism of St. Thomas, we showed a few different ways we can prove God exists. Because we can't know nature, we can't really know emotion, we can't really know anything. There's no method of looking out in the world and seeing that God exists. Why? Because as I said before, Kant's system, where his mind does not conform to reality, makes Kant's system, to believe this, you'd have to be mentally ill. And it's a mental illness to the point where you are incapable of believing in God or even knowing the moral system. Are there any questions about that? We cover a lot of stuff, but can you see the? Yeah, it's kind of is. It's more like it's more of a schizophrenia. It's more of a schizophrenia where you don't believe anything that's out there is real. Can you see the connection there? Yeah. But that's where a lot of modern thinking is based upon. Now, if I didn't say it, you'd be like, you might hear these things and be like, oh, okay, whatever. But when you connect all the dots, it's like, oh, this is actually really problematic. It's extremely problematic for Catholics.
Who else in the church?
Well, I wouldn't completely say John Paul II is a disciple. Let's give him let's give him the benefit of the doubt. He was influenced, and I think what John Paul II is trying to do in the theology of the body. So it was written as a defense of contraception, trying to show how contraception is a sin to the modern world. I think what he's trying to do is, okay, this is what modern people believe. I'm going to use their philosophy, their thinking to show that contraception is still bad. Okay? So it doesn't mean theology of the body is completely bad. At the same time, I think it's a mistake to have like theology of the body as the main moral theology for people in the church nowadays. I don't think John Paul II ever intended that. I don't think it's really that useful of a tool to really clearly explain sexual morality. I've studied theology of the body in one of my classes in college, and a lot of moral theology that I know, I can't defend it through the principles that John Paul II laid down. Like I can't really explain why homosexuality is wrong with theology of the body and many other things. I can't explain why they're disordered using theology of the body.
In Poland was never part of Western Civ. There's an Eastern phenomenology orientation, maybe similar to Kant or something.
Yeah, so
very different from the Western mind.
So phenomenology, basically, so after you have Kant, you have Heidegger, who started existentialism. Then at existentialism, you have phenomenology. And the phenomenologists are kind of like, oh, we're in this Kantian world. We need to get back to reality. Remember I told you about how Kant has the noumena, and which is a craziness, and phenomena is the way you perceive the world. Phenomenology is studying that phenomena. But with phenomenology, it's studying what you sense, but it's implying that even though you sense this, what you're sensing isn't what's actually out there. So phenomenology, I don't think is really anything. I don't know how phenomenology can be useful at all. Okay, so
Maybe not using the right term. My understanding is that the Eastern view is very different from the West, and that Poland was always part of that. It was never part of it.
Yeah.
And that influenced John Paul too. That's why I read them. Really.
So John Paul II was originally taught by Father Gregory Lagrange, the greatest Thomist of the last century. And then he was going for his doctorate, and Father Gregory Lagrange says John Paul II, he writes a lot, says very little, and refused to give him his doctorate. So John Paul II went to the university in Poland to take his doctorate. And that's when John Paul II, I can't remember the name of the university, but they were heavily influenced by phenomenology, and that's partly where John Paul II developed some of his modern thinking. Now, he did have some of St. Thomas, so you can see in some of his writings, you can see some of Father Gregory Lagrange's influence. So Fides et Ratio, his encyclical on faith and reason, very well written. You can see some of Gregory Lagrange's stuff in there. But in other writings, you see more of the modern, the new theology stuff that I'm not so much a fan of. But yeah, he kind of a mixture. I do think he's trying to use modern philosophy, because you do have, at a time period, a lot of Europe was heavily influenced by modern philosophy. So like, I forgetting the names, but like one of the main existentialists was French. You had a bunch of bad philosophers. No, it was another one. No, not Heidegger. Right after Heidegger. This guy right after Heidegger. Who was the guy right after Heidegger? Oh, he had a mistress and everything. He was famous for like he was in bed with a mistress and he had asked his wife to prepare breakfast for them. But Yeah, just not a good person at all. But I can't remember. He was an existentialist right after Heidegger. But anyways, you had a bunch of bad philosophers in Europe, and Father Gary Lagrange was actually writing against these philosophers that were into the church. Father Gary Lagrange was very much opposed to phenomenology, and he saw that as a danger in the church. And I do think John Paul II was trying to maybe just combat these in a positive way. Was he effective? How effective he was? Did he maybe cause more problems? Perhaps. But I think that was at least the thinking behind John Paul II. All right, that's everything I have to say. Are there any questions? There are two left. There are two classes left. All right, very good.